Next speaker is Boris Düdder, who joined DIKU in 2017. He came from the Technical University of Dortmund and worked in many different areas, but some of them are software engineering, fintech, security and privacy, as well as formal methods. Boris, stage yours.
Yeah. I will not talk so much about moonshots, essentially. So my question when I was invited was challenging, essentially, because one of the questions was, can you say something about sustainability? So since I work in formal methods, usually proofs are not so much related to sustainability. But so I took the liberty, essentially, to briefly think about why do we do what we are doing, essentially? Now, can I frame it in terms of sustainability? So one of the questions that we very often have is essentially our systems get applied. We have usually from scientific curiosity another motivation to pursue certain topics, of course, but very often we forget what is essentially the impact on society for that. And I will talk about part of our work that I do with our group. Essentially, one of the questions that we have when we work with systems is, what is the effect, essentially? Also, I can propose a lot of improvements, of course. Some are minuscule, others have bigger impacts, essentially. But how do I find out what is the impact, essentially? So essentially, I took the liberty in this talk to look a little bit more what is the impact of formal methods, and in particular on security. So security changes over time. No? When we talk about software security, hardware security, current trend is, of course, we see upcoming, hopefully somewhere in future, quantum computers that can attack current encryption schemes, essentially. So mid-90s, Peter Shaw found an algorithm that if you tweak it a little bit or rephrase the problem a little bit differently, can essentially factorize big numbers, essentially, using quantum computers. So which means essentially every algorithm that uses factorization is attackable via Shaw's algorithm. So which led to a lot of hectic work, in particular when the first commercial quantum computers showed up. It will take time, of course, but from security perspective, it is a big pressure that was exceeded on our environment, essentially. So that is the pressure that's building up. Either we evade or we build up resistance. From security, we rarely evade, so we need to build up resistance. So how did we do that? So essentially, one of the visible parts is, of course, how does it affect commercial systems? And you have probably seen also last week the official decree about how commercial systems should be built in the US that are quantum computer resistant. There is now a suite of different algorithms doing that. It's a good news. Bad news, some of them have been already attacked and cracked, so which is still an ongoing problem. So it is a rather strange process right now that we have not seen in the years before. But the important part, I would say, is definitely software and firmware. So software that is running either enabling hardware to provide services or on a level of applications get signed. So building trust, essentially, on the platform that we have. So we have seen a lot of approaches right now over the years, from trustworthy computing, for example. Microsoft was pushing that for the TKM platform, for example. You cannot build secure systems based solely on software. So you need the whole stack, essentially, from hardware that is trustworthy, and then you can build security on top of that. Because now the weakest link in the chain breaks all, and we have seen that over multiple years. We have seen that with TEs. Yes, of course, Intel is out of the business of TEs because they got broken so often. It didn't make any sense to invest in that anymore. So the hope is essentially going in this direction of different algorithms. So I will spare you all the details of these algorithms. But the idea behind that is essentially to make security, and here encryption in particular, future-proof. Good. Now, coming back to the topic of sustainability, I was thinking a little bit, we are computer scientists. We have learned computer science is a science of trade-offs, essentially. No? So there is no free lunch. No? So we always have to pay our bill, essentially. So how do we pay, essentially, the bill now for these new algorithms that are more expensive, of course, in computation? But I was more interested in how expensive are they with respect to environmental impact via energy, essentially. And it turned out it is essentially not that easy. So let's look a little bit where our computers usually run. Data centers. No? So everybody is using smartphones, tablets, and so on, but most of the computation is not local run. It's essentially in data centers. So the projection is in 2025, every 18 seconds, a user or all we will interact with data centers, essentially. So which means they are responsible for data, computation, and all the stuff around that. So which means also we put a lot of these energy consumption from devices that we usually carry around. No? We usually have low power devices to these compute centers. Right now we have 7.2 million data centers. No? Biggest fraction is run in the US with 2,670. And in particular, we see also the pressure now through regulation is it needs to be neutral with respect to climate. If you live in the US for quite a while, that was already law in California, so you could for many years not replace data centers if you were using more energy than the ones that you were replacing. One big problem with data centers is you have to tear them down. So essentially you cannot upgrade data centers. No? So they are throwaway technology. The important part is also where is the cost, essentially. It changed very much from infrastructure, producing a lot of heat usually, to really the server part. No? So that is an important trend that we see, and it's also ongoing. The biggest centers right now consume around 100 megawatt, and which means that is roughly 80,000 households. So it is really not that little. When we look into what is happening there, so cloud computers are still there, they will be there, of course. Traditional ones are dying off, essentially, at least in this trend, but hyperscale architectures are growing, essentially. So the computational demand, in particular of interconnected devices, is growing. So essentially, that is what we are seeing, and one of the predictions, at least, is that the energy consumptions of all data centers right now 2% grows up to 15% in the next years. No? So the estimate is 2035, which means everything that we do there has a very big lever. No? So every computation that we can spare and make more efficient has really an impact. Good. I promised to talk a little bit about cryptographic protocols, essentially security, which is interesting because there is not so much data material around how much energy they really consume. So I went a little bit through the studies and tried to aggregate some of the data there. So you see typical protocols, for example, Kerberos, that is usually used for key distribution, but also for tickets, so that you have built single sign-on services. The other one is essentially an elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, also for key exchange. So I chose two of the more expensive ones, but they are used everywhere. So every time you connect to a data center through a secure connection, essentially, these algorithms are executed, essentially. No? technically then used to switch to a much cheaper security or encryption method, but how much do they cost? So essentially, if you use here the computation in millijoule, no, that is the, let me see, can I, there's not a, here, no? Then for cameras, you use less than a tenth of a millijoule, which sounds innocent essentially. But if you, for example, use that with elliptic curve cryptography, then you are already up to 50 millijoule. So let's see a little bit when we now connect that to networks, because these protocols do exchange messages and multiple messages. So if we add also the perspective of message transfer, then we see cameras, even so computation is not so expensive, it is at least communication intensive. The cost is rather high. So, which means when you calculate that, then you're around 50 to 85 millijoule per invocation essentially, and also communication. And then looking up, when we use 100,000 calls, which is not much for a typical data center, then that sums up. And if you then look what that costed, I took the 2019 numbers because they were innocent. I know the current cost of energy is thrilling to a lot of people, so I took the old ones. Then for 100,000 we pay 0.1 krona and or 0.2 for krona per 100,000. But usually we talk about around about 10 million per hour for such a compute center. So you can understand a little bit, it has a big impact what you're doing. I took the liberty of using Wi-Fi here as an upper bound, so there are of course cheaper interconnects, but usually there is a Wi-Fi somewhere in between. And of course, that also grows about the number of hops that you do. So how direct is your connection to your compute center essentially? So if it's a local one, then of course you have usually 2 hops at least. If you have a longer one, then you run of course in multiple hops, and that grows also in price. So you see there, 2 minutes? Good. So you see there definitely the distance is important, so having local data centers makes a lot of sense, but also what you are doing. What is the cryptographic schemes that you are employing there? So what we are doing for a lot of projects is essentially we look into how can we make that efficient, without compromising the security properties of algorithms. As an extreme, usually I love to use blockchain because it's a very radical approach, zero trust environment. I don't trust anybody essentially. It has high costs, so which means it comes with a high price tag, and there is something that we can improve on. So which means when we look into high consistency, high integrity computational environments plus zero trust, then we end up with an enormous energy amount usually. We see switches to proof of stake, to other algorithms, and that they of course lower the cost, but essentially most of the cost really comes from the theoretical boundaries that we get from high consistency and zero trust requirements for such algorithms. And very often we go, in particular also with the students that are part here and sitting here, we are looking into the question, what happens if I now also add confidentiality and privacy to that? So if not everything is transparent, so not everybody is allowed to see the information that is stored there. So transparency is nice for auditability and so on, but if that is your IP, so your intellectual property, you are very hesitant to let everybody know that. So there we look, for example, in very efficient schemes for zero knowledge proofs. So where you prove a statement, but you don't leak any information about the statement, essentially. I'm on it. So that's also my last slide, so I get the point.